It's 7:58 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and a civilization is 2 minutes from dying. That's not a metaphor, that's not a movie trailer. That's what April 7th, 2026 actually looked like from inside the White House Situation Room, where military commanders had already loaded the targeting coordinates for 400 strikes across Iran, power plants, water systems, oil infrastructure, and the order to fire was sitting unsigned on a desk. The deadline was 8 p.m. Eastern. At 7:59, a message came through from Pakistan. And just like that, everything stopped. Now you're sitting here, probably watching oil prices tick downward on your phone, watching your portfolio breathe again, thinking maybe the worst is over. But here's the thing nobody is saying out loud right now. The deal that just saved civilization isn't actually a deal. It's a countdown, and the clock starts today. 14 days, that's what stands between the fragile exhale the world just took, and something economists are privately calling the most dangerous economic scenario since 1973. 2 weeks to either lock in peace or watch oil spike past $130 a barrel, global markets collapse, and a war that's already killed 3,400 people spiral into something no one can contain. And your money, your portfolio, your gas prices, your grocery bills sits directly in the middle of it. So let's talk about what actually just happened, and more importantly, what happens next. Rewind to February 2025. Donald Trump is back in the White House, and he is not interested in patience. He reinstates what his team calls the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, meaning crushing sanctions, oil export restrictions pushed to zero, and a very clear message to Tehran: get to the table or face the consequences. Iran doesn't come to the table, not fast enough anyway. By June 2025, the U.S. launches what becomes known as Operation Midnight Hammer, targeted strikes on Iran's underground nuclear facilities. Iran retaliates, Hezbollah activates, Houthi drones start hitting Gulf shipping lanes, and what began as a pressure campaign quietly becomes a war. Fast forward to late March 2026. Iran has done something that no one expected. They've effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. You've probably never thought about the Strait of Hormuz in your life, but here's why it just became the most expensive piece of water on the planet. 20% of the world's crude oil passes through that strait every single day. 20%. That means every barrel of oil that powers European factories, heats Japanese homes, fuels American gas stations, it has to squeeze through that 21-mile choke point, and Iran just put a lock on the door. Oil prices didn't gradually rise, they detonated. Within weeks, West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. benchmark for crude, had climbed to levels not seen since the chaos of 2008. Supply chains started cracking, shipping costs tripled, and ordinary Americans started seeing it at the pump, in their utility bills, inside grocery stores where every product that gets trucked or flown anywhere suddenly costs more. This is the backdrop. This is the world you're living in right now, on the day the ceasefire was announced. So who blinked first? The honest answer is no one is sure, and that's actually the most dangerous part of this story. Here's what we know happened. Trump set a hard deadline, 8 p.m. Tuesday. Meet my demands, and he said this publicly. A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. Critics called it a potential war crime. His allies called it leverage. Either way, the U.S. military's operational plan for a massive bombing campaign targeting Iranian civilian infrastructure was ready. The bombers were in position. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had been working the phones for 72 hours straight. Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, all of them acting as back channels. And somewhere in those final hours, Iran sent a 10-point peace proposal to Washington through the Pakistani intermediary. At 7:59 p.m., Trump posted on Truth Social, "Ceasefire, 2 weeks, subject to Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz." Markets reacted instantly. Oil dropped 13% in 30 minutes. The S&P 500 futures surged more than 2%. The world exhaled. Relief spread across financial terminals from New York to Tokyo. But here's the first thing you need to understand. Both sides immediately declared victory, and when two sides who just spent 5 weeks bombing each other both claim they won the same negotiation, that's not a good sign. That's the signature of a deal so vague, so unresolved, that each side is filling in the blanks with what they want it to say. Iran's Supreme National Security Council released a statement calling the ceasefire an enduring defeat for Washington. The White House called it a total and complete victory for the United States. J.D. Vance, who helped broker the final hours, called it something different from both of them. He called it a fragile truce. and Vance is probably the one telling the truth. So what does each side actually want? Because this is where the story gets complicated and where your money gets directly involved. The United States walked into this negotiation with what's being called a 15-point framework. The full text hasn't been published, but the core demands are clear. Washington wants Iran to completely abandon its nuclear weapons program. Not pause it, not limit it, abandon it. They want Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, the material that's one technical step from being weapons grade, physically removed from the country or destroyed. Defense Secretary Hegseth said this week that the U.S. knows exactly where it is, that it's buried, and that Iran will either hand it over voluntarily or face the alternative. The U.S. also wants Iran to permanently end its support for what Tehran calls the axis of resistance, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, every group the U.S. designates as a terrorist organization. Washington wants those relationships severed, and critically, America wants the Strait of Hormuz open permanently, unconditionally, with no Iranian toll collection, no Iranian control over who passes through. That's the American ask. It's essentially demanding that Iran give up every piece of strategic leverage it has accumulated over the last 30 years in exchange for an end to sanctions and a promise not to bomb them again. Now look at it from Tehran's side. Iran's 10-point proposal is almost a mirror image. They want every US and UN sanction lifted, all of them. They want Iranian assets, money frozen in foreign banks. Some estimates put the total at over $100 billion, released immediately. They want US combat forces withdrawn from every military base across the Middle East. They want financial reparations for the damage caused by 5 weeks of bombing, and they want their right to enrich uranium formally recognized. There's one more demand that might be the most significant of all. Iran wants formal control over the Strait of Hormuz, meaning ships would have to coordinate passage with Iran's armed forces, meaning Iran would effectively hold a permanent key to 20% of the world's oil supply forever. Trump rejected that idea publicly, saying if anything, the US should be collecting the tolls, but it's still sitting in Iran's formal proposal as a non-negotiable point. These are not small gaps, these are opposite realities, and the two sides have 14 days to close them. Here's what makes this genuinely terrifying from an economic standpoint. The world didn't wait for a permanent deal to price in the good news. Markets already celebrated, oil already dropped, investors already repositioned. The market is pricing in peace before peace actually exists. That's the trap. If these talks in Islamabad collapse, if either side walks away, if Israel escalates in Lebanon and pulls Iran back into full combat, if the hardliners inside Tehran who are calling this ceasefire a humiliation gain enough power to torpedo the deal, markets don't just return to where they were, they overcorrect. Panic pricing in oil markets doesn't work the way a calm readjustment does. When fear comes back after a false relief rally, it hits harder than the original fear. What does that look like in practice? Energy analysts who have modeled the scenarios are talking about WTI crude at $130, potentially $150 a barrel if the Strait fully closes again and a second military campaign begins. For context, when oil hit $130 during the 2022 Ukraine shock, U.S. gas prices averaged over $5 a gallon nationally. Some cities hit $7. And that was a partial supply disruption. This would be a near-total disruption of Gulf shipping combined with active military conflict. The inflationary impact wouldn't stay at the gas pump. It never does. Airline tickets, heating bills, plastic packaging, fertilizer, which is made from natural gas, meaning food prices at the farm level start rising within weeks. The Federal Reserve, which has been carefully navigating interest rate policy, would face an impossible choice: raise rates to fight oil-driven inflation and risk triggering a recession, or hold rates and let inflation run. There's no good option in that scenario. In your portfolio, energy stocks would spike. Everything else, consumer discretionary, tech, real estate, would fall. The companies that got beaten down during 5 weeks of war, that just started recovering on ceasefire news, would get hit again. Possibly harder because expectations got raised and then shattered. The investors who will lose the most in that scenario are the ones who reposition today, assuming the deal is done. Now flip it, let's say the deal works. Let's say Islamabad produces a real framework. Iran hands over or agrees to destroy its enriched uranium stockpile. The Strait stays open. Sanctions start lifting. What does that world look like economically? Oil prices fall further, potentially back into the $70s. That's a supply story. Iranian crude re-enters the global market, Gulf shipping resumes fully, and the war premium that's been baked into every barrel since late February evaporates. Lower oil is effectively a tax cut for every American who drives, flies, heats their home, or buys anything that moves through a supply chain, which is everyone. Markets rally, but more selectively than today's initial relief bounce. Defense stocks would pull back. Energy producers would face margin compression. But consumer companies, airlines, retail, manufacturing, anything that runs on cheap energy gets a quiet tailwind that shows up in earnings over the next 2 to 3 quarters. There's a longer-term piece too. If sanctions on Iran are genuinely lifted, Iran sits on the 4th largest proven oil reserves in the world. That supply coming back online over 2 to 3 years adds meaningful downward pressure on global oil prices for the rest of the decade. That's structurally good for inflation, structurally good for interest rates, and structurally good for the kind of growth assets, growth stocks, real estate, long-duration bonds that get crushed when rates stay high. The deal scenario isn't just things go back to normal. It's potentially a significant positive macro shift for the global economy heading into 2027 and beyond, but only if it's real. And right now, it isn't real yet. So what are you actually watching over the next 14 days? The talks in Islamabad begin Friday. The U.S. delegation reportedly includes Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and J.D. Vance. That's an unusually senior lineup, which either means Trump is serious about closing this or he wants the photo opportunity of a historic deal, possibly both. Watch what happens with Lebanon. Israel has publicly stated that the ceasefire does not cover its operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Pakistan's prime minister says it does. Iran says it does. If Israeli strikes continue in Lebanon and Hezbollah retaliates in ways that draw Iran back in, the ceasefire framework breaks before the ink dries. This is the most likely single point of failure in the next 14 days. Watch the uranium question. This is the deal breaker at the negotiating table. Iran's position that it has the right to enrich uranium is fundamentally incompatible with America's position that Iran cannot possess near weapons-grade material. Someone has to give, and neither side has signaled they will. Watch oil not as a number, but as a signal. If WTI starts creeping back above $100 during the 2-week window, it means traders are losing confidence in the deal. If it keeps falling toward $85, the market is starting to believe. And watch your own positioning, because the single most expensive mistake investors make during geopolitical crises is not acting too slowly. It's acting at the wrong moment in the news cycle, either panic selling at the bottom or euphoria buying at a false peak. Here's the thing about these 14 days that nobody is saying clearly enough. This ceasefire isn't the end of a crisis. It's the beginning of a negotiation. And negotiations between two sides who both publicly claim they won, while privately knowing the gap between them is enormous, have a very specific historical track record. Sometimes they work. Sometimes they produce something real, a framework that holds, that both sides can live with, that quietly reshapes the world's energy map and brings a decade of lower oil prices and lower inflation with it. And sometimes the clock just runs out. The world is watching Islamabad. Your portfolio is watching Islamabad. And whether you know it or not, you are too. 14 days. What happens next is not written yet.